Things move much more quickly now. Hannibal is on the march. In Rome, the engines of war are turning. Legions have been called up. Naval forces already engaged in war across the Adriatic in Illyria are expanded, and a task force is sent to Sicily to engage the Carthaginians on the high seas and to invade Africa. Another fleet is being prepared to take legions to Spain and to strike at Hannibal or at any of his lieutenants in charge of his base of operations. It is spring of 218 BC. In Rome, 2 men have just taken office as the new consuls, Publius Cornelius Scipio and Tiberius Sempronius Longus. The plan is for Scipio to take his army to Spain. Tiberius Sempronius Longus, meanwhile, is sent to Sicily so that he might prepare an invasion of Africa. The Romans have reacted much as Hannibal expected, not waiting for him to come to them, but rather striking out hard, fast, and first. This aggression and their tenacity have helped the Romans overcome all obstacles to their ascendancy now for centuries. Once just a central Italian town populated by a motley crew of refugees and immigrants, Rome is now the capital of one of the 2 great powers in the West. But they didn't account for Hannibal's adaptation to their habits. He knew that the Romans would come for him, so he has marched rapidly out of Spain and is now crossing southern Gaul, making friends where he can and subjugating those who do not see him as liberator. He hopes to charge into Italy just after the Romans have sent their forces away to war, chasing after his phantom in Spain or stranding themselves on the African coast while he invades the Roman Republic. And out of this maelstrom of ambition, war, and audacity, our Western traditions will be born. Hannibal's first great victory in the war was not against the Romans, but against the Gauls. Specifically against the Volcae tribe of Gauls that lived near the mouth of the Rhone River. The Volcae were not enthused about Hannibal's arrival in southern Gaul because they had already heard about his subjugation of the Celts in Iberia, and because they were friendly neighbors, if not allies, to the city of Massilia, modern-day Marseille, which was a Roman ally. So the Volcae stood ready for Hannibal on the east bank of the Rhone River in September 218 BC as he approached with his army from the west. Estimates of the size of his army differ, but it was at least 50,000 total men. Cavalry may have numbered as much as 8,000 or 9,000 of that total, and of course there were nearly 40 elephants. Hannibal could not afford to waste time being challenged at a river crossing. Much like Alexander the Great of the century before, then he made quick work of this obstacle. He secretly sent a large force upstream, and when that flanking party had had enough time to cross over, he marched the main body of his army straight across the river, as if he was willing to take on the Gauls in frontal assault. But as their armies met, his detached forces came downriver on the enemy's right flank, and the Gauls were defeated and dispersed. But as he rallied his exultant, victorious troops on the east bank of the river, another step closer to Rome, Hannibal received shocking news from his scouts. A Roman fleet had arrived at the mouth of the river, just a day's march away. This did not fit into the plan. The Romans were supposed to be on their way to Spain and Africa. Hannibal was supposed to be marching on Italy's undefended northwestern frontier. How could the Romans have found him? The Roman fleet was under the command of Publius Cornelius Scipio, one of the 2 consuls for that year, and it was just one of those chance series of circumstances that upset even the greatest of plans that brought him to the Rhone River that day. You see, the uprisings in northern Italy had diverted troops originally intended for Spain, and Scipio had been forced to recruit a fresh army for his proposed invasion of the Iberian Peninsula. The delays involved had led to him only just now arriving by sail on the southern coast of Gaul. It appears that Scipio had known by then that Hannibal had crossed the Pyrenees Mountains, but he had no idea that the Carthaginians had come so far so fast. So the coming encounter would be a surprise for him as well. Because Hannibal, learning the news about this arriving fleet, had sent 500 Numidian cavalry to investigate. The Romans, however, had sent these horsemen flying back to Hannibal. But it was fundamental to Hannibal's genius that no matter how good he was at battle planning, he was equally good at adapting to the moment. He had no desire to battle the Romans here in southern Gaul. There was nothing to be won. He wanted to invade Italy and to terrify the people of Rome. So he crossed his army back over the river to the west bank of the Rhone and headed upstream to find another crossing and to resume an uncontested march into Italy. But this was a decision more momentous than it might seem at first glance. Hannibal had intended to take a route into Italy closer to the Mediterranean shoreline, where the Alps mountain range might be crossed at more humble altitudes. By heading north before making a right turn into Italy, Hannibal was also choosing to cross the Alps at higher altitudes and through the territories of certainly hostile mountain tribes. Now, down through the centuries, much has been made of Hannibal's travails in the mountain passes. His losses were great, and his failure to defeat Rome has been blamed by more than one historian on the initial devastation suffered by his army amid hostile tribes and an equally hostile, wind-blown, snow-covered environment. The Greco-Roman historian Polybius, though, even less than a century after the events in question, called out the many such portrayals of Hannibal's crossing of the Alps as ridiculous. As he pointed out, many authors of the time and later suggested that the crossing of the Alps was a foolhardy gesture, the act of a desperate man whose original plan has gone awry, and he was now forced by his own gambling nature to lead its army to its own destruction. Polybius gives Hannibal more credit than that. He points out that Hannibal had formed an army and marched it through many difficult circumstances already. He was a master general, not someone who flopped through strategic decisions thoughtlessly and just threw away his army. Yes, Carthaginian losses during the pass were great, and I will detail them in a moment, but these losses were more due to a series of unfortunate events than they were to any fundamental flaw in Hannibal's strategic decision to cross the Alps where he did. Polybius goes on to rightly point out that numerous Celtic tribes had made the exact same crossing of the Alps multiple times in their wars with the Romans, that many people lived prosperously in these mountain passes, and that he himself, the historian Polybius, had made the crossing. And yes, the land was rugged, but so was Hannibal, and so were his men. No, any ambitious plan possesses a number of critical junctures during which things must go right in order to achieve maximum success, and as it turned out, things did not go right for Hannibal. Climbing the mountains, his army suffered numerous combat losses against hostile tribes, and it may also be the case that he took a wrong turn at the pass and ended up descending the mountains down a route that he was not prepared to use. Finally, conditions during the descent, wherever it happened, were more brutal than expected. Weather can be unpredictable like that. Polybius estimates that as many men and animals died on the descent as did during the fighting ascent. But the impact was likely more on the animals. There was nothing to feed on as the heavy snows blanketed the ground, and a disproportionate number of the men who died were Africans from a much warmer climate, unprepared and insufficiently clothed for the savage cold. When Hannibal emerged from the mountains in the Padus Valley, 15 days after the beginning of the crossing, he was followed by just 20,000 infantry and 6,000 horsemen. Possibly as many as 12 elephants survived the passage through the Alps. He had lost over half his fighting men. And these men were in such bad condition that Hannibal, being the excellent commander that he was, knew that he must avoid battle if possible. As they were in their total numbers and condition, his troops would probably not even be able to defend themselves against a singular consular army, let alone conquer the Roman Republic. His men needed time to find food and to recover not just physically, but also morally from the terror of the crossing. Today, we would look at his starved, stunned, and tortured-looking soldiers as men suffering from severe PTSD. Yet Hannibal also desperately needed to make contact with the Boii and the Insubres, two tribes of Gauls who were eagerly awaiting his arrival to help them liberate themselves from the Romans. and he needed to subdue the locals here in the Padus Valley in order to ensure the safety of his men while they rested. So Hannibal got to work making himself at home in northern Italy. But even as he was carrying out these operations to secure a base camp in Italy, sometime in November of 218 BC, Hannibal received another shocking bit of news. Roman forces under Publius Cornelius Scipio were approaching from the south. Again, though he had studied the Romans all his life, the Romans had surprised Hannibal with their own rapid adaptations to the situations of war. He had probably been sure that his own boldness had won him an opportunity to recover from his losses, but here the Romans were already, when his army was in no condition for major battle. But if nothing else, this is the tale of the meeting of two forces who each believe that the best defense is a good offense. Hannibal could not manage another retreat now, so he saddled up, rallied all his cavalry, and galloped headlong into the first of several sharp battles that would define the early years of the Second Punic War. We last saw Publius Cornelius Scipio in September in southern Gaul, where he encountered Hannibal for the first time. The Carthaginian general had led his forces away from that potential clash in order to reach the Alps and cross over into Italy. Scipio had readjusted quickly to this new situation. He put his brother in charge of his army, loaded all the troops back into the ships, and sent them on to Spain. The original mission would not be changed due to Hannibal's movements. Scipio himself, however, returned to northern Italy. As the nearest consul, he took over command of the army that was fighting the Gauls there, the force which had been originally intended to fight Hannibal, but had been diverted to deal with the uprisings in the north. And so Scipio and his army were ready for Hannibal's surprised and haggard forces when they came down from the mountain passes. Having already fortified a place on the western bank of the river Ticinus, not far from modern-day Placentia, Scipio advanced toward Hannibal. He personally led a recon party consisting of a few thousand cavalry and light infantry to find out more about Hannibal's position. But Hannibal wasted no more time than Scipio did. He led out all his cavalry, probably 6,000 African and Spanish horsemen, in his own response. The two forces clashed sharply. A contingent of Numidian cavalry circled round to the rear of the Romans, and suddenly Scipio was surrounded. In the ensuing battle, he was severely wounded, and he was only brought out of the battle alive thanks to the bravery of his 18-year-old son, who bore the same name. We will hear more about this other Publius Cornelius Scipio in future episodes. With their cavalry wing decimated and their commander gravely injured, the Romans destroyed their bridgehead and pulled back across the river. Things really began to roll Hannibal's way now. He received envoys from nearby Gallic tribes interested in coming over to him, and 2,000 of the Romans' Gallic allies, enrolled as cavalry in the Roman ranks, rose up, betraying the Romans at night and slaughtering the legionaries nearest them before fleeing the camp to join Hannibal. So Scipio fell back again. His new goal was to make a stand near the city of Placentia and to keep Hannibal from joining up with the Boii, the Gallic tribe that lived further east. And all this time, Scipio himself was gravely wounded and trying to recover. Surely Hannibal must have felt revived now. Due to incoming assistance from local Gauls, he probably now commanded 40,000 troops. This army was not what he had originally envisioned for his invasion, but it was much better than the ragged band that had descended from the mountain passes with him, hungry and hurried. Now they were once again an army, with a battlefield victory behind them and a retreating enemy before them. Early December 218 BC, Scipio, still recovering from his wounds, has stationed his depleted army south of Placentia, near the river Trebia. Hannibal and his eager-blooded army have camped 5 or 6 miles away. The situation, though, has continued to develop. At some point that fall, either after Scipio first learned that Hannibal was approaching or after the defeat at the river Ticinus, The Roman Senate had sent for Tiberius Sempronius Longus. He was the other consul for that year, all the way down in Sicily with his army intended to invade Carthage. In a testimony to the speed of both communication and travel in the Roman era, this commander and his army were all transported from Sicily to northern Italy in just 40 days, and they arrived just in time for the Battle of the Trebia. Given that there were now two consular armies camped together, we can surmise a size of about 40,000 total men in the Roman forces, including their allies. Whatever subtractions we might make for Scipio's losses earlier were probably compensated for by certain additional allies that Sempronius had brought with him. Thus, they were numerically a match for the probably disappointed Hannibal, who had surely hoped to outnumber the harried Romans at the next battle. However, Hannibal would have two distinct advantages in this coming battle: his cavalry and his own battle genius. The Romans, as was their standard, only had about 4,000 cavalry in these two consular armies. The strength of the legions had always been in the stalwartness, especially of their Roman infantry. But Hannibal had brought with him more than 10,000 cavalry troops to this battle, both from his own original men and from his new Gallic allies. However, this meant that the Roman infantry outnumbered the Carthaginians, and this suited the Roman temperament. They would just bowl their way through the Carthaginian center and destroy Hannibal's main body of troops. After that, it would just be a matter of mopping up the rest. They underestimated Hannibal and his cavalry. The Roman cavalry on the flanks of the battle were quickly routed, and the Carthaginian horsemen turned against the flanks of that large Roman infantry mass. Furthermore, Hannibal had earlier sent his younger brother Mago off with 2,000 horse and light infantry to get to the Roman rear, which they did. They had the Romans surrounded. There is disagreement about the number and nature of the Roman casualties in this engagement, but there is no disagreement about the outcome. It was a Roman disaster. Longus, the consul, appears to have indeed broken the Carthaginian center with his tough Roman infantry corps, but the rest of the army was scattered. Some historians suggest that virtually all of these others were killed or captured, but regardless, Longus and his body of infantry saw the destruction and, maintaining their unit cohesion, were able to remove themselves from the battlefield intact. They joined the wounded Scipio in the town of Placentia. Scipio, having seen the results of the battle from where he lay wounded in the Roman base camp, had immediately abandoned the site and removed to the town of Placentia, which could be held securely because it could be supplied by Roman boats coming up the river Po. This base secured, Longus returned to Rome to calm the public, which had already been alarmed by the news of disaster which had preceded him. Here, according to Roman traditions, he oversaw the elections of the consuls for the next year before returning to Placentia to finish his term as consul. The new consuls, Gaius Flaminius and Servilius Geminus, would begin recruiting their armies for the year 217 BC, while Scipio and Longus continued to hold on in the north. And Hannibal's army continued to grow. Gaius Flaminius, elected consul for the year 217 BC, he came to power at the time of Rome's greatest danger. It had been a long road for Flaminius and his peers. He was one of the new men, the novus homos, whose family did not have a heralded aristocratic past. As if his modest heritage was not offensive enough to the old guard in the Senate, he was a troublemaker, a rabble-rouser. Elected as the tribune of the plebeians in 232 BC, he had lobbied for and successfully passed a land law that handed over newly won territory in the north to common citizens of Rome. This law is remembered as the Lex Flaminia, named for him, and it would not be his last contribution to Roman culture. In the 15 years between then and his command in 217 BC, his legislative activity would result in the building of the Circus Flaminius, a racetrack in Rome, and in the construction of the Via Flaminia, a critically important road that connected Rome to its Adriatic coastline. He was first elected consul in 223 BC, so this was his second time at Rome's helm, a sign that he was greatly admired by a significant portion of Romans. The year of his second election, 217 BC, he was chosen to take command of the struggling armies in the north. Rome was stretching its wartime customs to the limit. Normally, each year brought the election of 2 consuls and the formation of an army around each of them. Usually, this was enough to guard the nation and to carry out any needed offensive operations. But ever since the First Punic War, there had been pretty regular exceptions to this rule. A praetor was now usually placed as governor over Sicily and forces there. Flaminius himself had been that governor in previous years, and another ruled over Sardinia and Roman forces there. And this year, the consulship of the wounded Publius Cornelius Scipio would be prorogued. That is, he would be kept on as an additional consul or a proconsul. For the year 218 BC, a total of 12 legions had been formed, but for 217 BC, the Senate called for that total number to increase to 22 legions, and this in spite of all their losses. These forces were not all that was facing Hannibal, though. Only 2 consular armies were designated for that task. The others were guarding important regions like Sicily, which would have to provide more of Rome's grain now that northern and central Italy were under attack. Legions were also simultaneously fighting in Spain and elsewhere, something that we will hear more about in the next episode. Additional troops were being drawn up to form an army just to defend the area around Rome in case of invasion from any quarter, and the fleets were expanded and maneuvered to better protect Rome's shores and trade routes. In hindsight, no matter what a person might think of the mostly aristocratic Roman senators, you must admit that they were capable stewards of the nation's security. Hannibal, seeing how Rome adjusted capably to his presence, was not put off. In the spring of 217 BC, he drove his well-rested army straight into the heart of Italy, heading south into Etruria, the old Etruscan homeland, and going straight toward Rome, apparently. Hannibal had bypassed the army under Flaminius, which had been expecting to meet him in battle somewhere near modern-day Arezzo. Hannibal knew that the Romans would be forced to chase him as he ravaged the Italian countryside. The Roman legions that followed after him would have to see the destroyed farmland and the shocked refugees, their countrymen, as they fruitlessly chased after this terror of Rome. But Hannibal also understood that his army, no matter how well he commanded it, was not enough to conquer Rome. He needed to destroy more Roman soldiers and lower the morale of Rome's allies so that they might turn against the great city with him. So when his army reached the north shores of Lake Trasimene in central Italy, he turned to fight Flaminius and his consular army. Now, there are 2 very big reasons why the consul Flaminius should not have taken this opportunity to fight Hannibal. First, he was terribly outnumbered. At best guess, we think that Flaminius's consular army plus allies totaled no more than 25,000 men, while Hannibal surely had 40,000 or more. Second, he marched his army into a battle with the Carthaginian and other forces who were waiting for him on the shore of the lake. This lake was screened by a range of low hills. Here, unbeknownst to Flaminius, who had not scouted the area, Hannibal had hidden thousands of his light infantry and cavalry. So Flaminius marched his troops into a narrow defile and made contact with a strong formation of Hannibal's infantry. The Roman columns piled up as progress slowed and their advanced troops battled with the enemy. And then the ambush was sprung. Hannibal's troops poured down from the hills into the Roman flanks. Many Roman units simply panicked and they were cut to pieces. The lead Roman infantry formation managed to bull its way through the Carthaginians at their front and escape the massacre. But later that day they were surrounded and captured. Of the 25,000 men in the fighting force, some historians estimate a total of 15,000 dead, when counting on those who died of wounds later as well. This included the consul Flaminius, who died fighting in the chaos. The remainder of the Roman soldiers and allies were captured. Those captured men who were only allies to Rome were well treated and sent home, quote-unquote liberated in the eyes of Hannibal, who hoped thus to win over the allies to his cause. The captured Romans, though, were mistreated, poorly fed, and sold into slavery. The soldiers of the victorious Carthaginian army now dressed themselves in captured Roman armor. News of the debacle reached Rome quickly. The city populace was thrown into panic. A praetor by the name of Marcus Pomponius Matho stood before all in the forum and announced, surely with all the gravity expected of a Roman orator, what had to be accepted. We have been defeated in a great battle. And the bad news continued to roll in after that. Subsequent to the disaster at Trasimene, the other consul for the year, Geminus, approaching along the Via Flaminia, had sent his cavalry ahead of his army. Ostensibly a wise move, it turned into another defeat, as the Carthaginian cavalry detected this reconnaissance and sallied forth with superior numbers of horse troops. The cavalry element, then, of this other consular army was completely wiped out. Amid this bedlam of defeat, there was a call for a dictatorship. In Rome, there were two particularly strong political factions in the Roman Senate at this time, and they are now styled as the Fabian faction and the Aemilian faction, the latter sometimes known as the Aemilian Scipionic faction. The Fabian faction was led by Quintus Fabius Maximus. I mentioned him in the previous episode. He had already been both consul and dictator of Rome for many years before and was now in his 60s. Once elected dictator this time around, his approach was not that of so many others who had preceded him in power. He did not rush to meet Hannibal. Fabius first looked to secure Rome itself, to secure her ports and her trade, and to aid the people of the countryside in defending themselves. Possibly he understood that Roman forces, having been defeated so many times going head-to-head with Hannibal, needed to learn something before they took him on again. Only after giving a series of defensive orders, such as that commanding rural Romans to destroy houses and crops and to take refuge in the nearest large city, Fabius gathered 4 full legions to himself, the equivalent of 2 consular armies, and went on the hunt for Hannibal. The Carthaginian army had been busy all this time, marching across the boot of Italy, north of Rome, all the way to the Adriatic Sea, burning and looting as they went. Hannibal reached the coast in July and rested his army there for perhaps a few weeks. Soon, Fabius and his Roman armies showed up. Hannibal presented his forces for battle, but Fabius would not engage, and this became the pattern that he would establish in meeting Hannibal on the battlefield. Fabius would harass Hannibal's foraging parties and destroy crops and livestock in the area surrounding Hannibal, hoping to weaken his army through starvation, all the while refusing to give battle. He would become known afterwards as Fabius Cunctatio, Fabius the Delayer. Initially, it was a term of scorn. Romans would later learn to appreciate the wisdom of Fabius, but only after Hannibal had chastised them multiple times. As his dictatorship wore on, characterized by this strategy of caution, 2 particular aspects of Roman society came into play and jeopardized the city's latest salvation. Those 2 things are Roman religiosity and political factionalism. Fabius was called back to Rome late in the year because the dictator was needed to oversee the elections of the interim consul and who was meant to replace the dead Flaminius. But we're also told that Fabius was needed for some important religious ceremonies, and we suspect, though the histories do not say so, that he was being called back by an impatient Senate and people who wondered where his victories were. Fabius had allowed Hannibal to march away from his base on the coast and had meekly followed him without giving battle. Fabius himself was known for being quite religious also. One of the first things that he had declared upon taking dictatorial power was that Rome had lost so many battles, not simply due to the ineptitude of commanders or troops, but because Rome had become sloppy in its religion, failing to carry out the state ceremonies with the precision that had defined its former days. And so, while he was giving all those orders shoring up the security of the state, he had also been leading with exacting accuracy the ceremonies and sacrifices properly due to the gods of Rome. And as leader of his own powerful faction, he was naturally the target of the opposing faction, who had actually forced him at this point to accept one of their own as his master of horse. The master of horse in a dictator's army was essentially his second in command, and in this case, it was a man named Minucius Rufus. So, called back to Rome at this critical juncture, both to live out his religious devotion and to face political enemies, Fabius was forced to leave his armies under the command of this Rufus, who had all along been chafing to order an attack. Fabius had, of course, urged Rufus not to attack Hannibal while he was gone, but this warning fell on deaf ears. While Fabius was acting as high priest in Rome, Rufus led a limited but successful attack on Hannibal, forcing the Carthaginian general to fall back. When news of this minor victory reached the Senate as they were about to send Fabius back, many leaders felt that this was proof that Rome needed to resume the offensive. As a result, before Fabius left the city to return to the battlefield in his army, they passed a completely unprecedented law to give the master of horse equal power to the dictator. Nonsensical on its face, this order basically made the dictator not a dictator. It reduced him in a way to a form of consulship, sharing power with a partner. Upon his return to the army, the two men, Fabius and Rufus, decided to share power by simply each taking control of one of the two armies in the field, but having no unified command, therefore. Hannibal, though, had just as superior an intelligence service as he had numbers, and as he had cavalry and battlefield acumen. He knew right away that the Romans were now divided on the field as well as in city politics. There was not one large army facing him, but two smaller ones, either of which he could overcome at his choosing. So he set a trap for the overeager Rufus, placing an apparently inferior force of light infantry and cavalry very close to Rufus's camp. Rufus took the bait and sent a stronger force to drive off the Carthaginians, but Hannibal fed more troops slowly into the battle, and in response then so did Rufus. The Roman master of horse eventually engaged his entire army and then found himself in full-blown combat with Hannibal, and was only saved at the last minute by the intervention of Fabius and his army. Plutarch, in his biography of Fabius, recounts a touching story here, that Rufus forswore his rivalry with the dictator after this reversal, and that Fabius gained a new ally in Roman politics. November eventually came, though, and the 6 months of the dictatorship were up, and it was time for Fabius to relinquish power. When his term ended, power automatically reverted to the two consuls that were already elected for that year, Geminus and Attilius Regulus. The latter had been elected to fill out the remainder of dead Flaminius's year. And so the year changed, as did the leadership in the field, but Hannibal remained, chastened by Roman resilience perhaps, but still strong, and looking for an opportunity to defeat another Roman army in battle. Winter passed, elections were held, new consuls took office, new legions were formed. The routines, rituals, and customs of Rome held true. But the Senate was adjusting to this new, unprecedented situation. The war was now completing 2 official years of duration. An enemy army had not only invaded Italy, but it had made its home there. Hannibal and his armed horde of mercenaries and allies were resting comfortably in southeastern Italy, having moved their base of operations to a place near the small city of Cannae. From here, the Carthaginians were comfortably ravaging the land around them for supplies and continuing to demoralize Rome and her allies. In the meantime, the outgoing consuls of the previous year were discouraged from engaging with Hannibal until new Roman forces could arrive in the region. In the spring of that year, 216 BC, the Roman Senate had responded to the emergency by authorizing not just the enrollment of even more legions, but the fielding of an army bigger than any that had been sent out before. So far, Hannibal had been able to manhandle 2 consular armies at the same time, a total of 4 legions and their allied supporting forces. The Senate, therefore, proposed to form a single army from 8 legions, with each legion also being reinforced to the size of 5,000 total Roman infantry and 300 horsemen each. These numbers do not include the allies, who were asked that year to supply even larger numbers of cavalry. The new consuls for that year were Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. The choice of this partnership demonstrates one continuing adherence to a policy that had not seemed to do well for Rome's fortunes in the past. Command of the most important army in the field that year was not just divided between the two men, Paulus and Varro, but between two philosophies. Aemilius Paulus, an aristocrat, advised a Fabian caution in the situation. The other consul, Varro, was a novus homo, son of a wealthy merchant who had, like many other men in the last years, essentially bought his way into the ranks of the Senate. He desired immediate battle and a quick resolution of the issue. In the past, before this war, consular armies had always worked separately, so there was no established system for commanding such a united force. Even dictators of the past, while they had supreme military power, had never encountered situations which required both consular armies in one battle. In the previous year, no one had thought it wrong to let the two consular armies, technically under the command of Fabius, to essentially operate as separate armies merely occupying the same battlefield. The solution proposed this year was to send the two armies against Hannibal together, but to alternate command daily between the consuls, one day Paulus and the next day Varro. Together, they commanded a force totaling probably more than 80,000 men against Hannibal, who had probably around 50,000 troops altogether. The two consuls for 216 BC, after formally entering into office, marshaled their new forces and marched off to Apulia, the southeastern region of Italy in which the town of Cannae was located and where Hannibal was based. There they combined forces with the legions in the field and began to prepare for a final showdown with Hannibal. Their preparations were probably complete sometime in July of that year. Hannibal's intelligence service, though, was unmatched. He already knew much about the men sent to face him. He knew that Varro, on any given day that he was commanding, was more likely to take the offer of battle and come at the Carthaginians headlong, trusting in the tough Roman center mass of legionaries to cut through an enemy. And Hannibal had a counter-strategy prepared specially just for that tactic. On the 2nd of August, then, the tragedy unfolded. Varro, in command over the Roman army that day, accepted the offer of battle. The armies faced each other on the northern bank of the Aufidus River. The Romans, confident in their overwhelming superiority in numbers and the discipline of their legions, came straight at him. They were overwhelmingly successful, bursting through Hannibal's center, pushing his line of battle troops back like a bending bow. Perhaps even there was a moment here, like when the eye of a storm passes over a scene of destruction enacted only a few moments before, when Hannibal's Spanish and African mercenaries fled before them along with their Gaulish allies, and the Romans could imagine an end to Hannibal's terror. Then, as Hannibal had planned all along, the flanks of his army, which had given way before the Romans, along with his cavalry that had circled round to the back, now turned and surrounded the Romans and attacked simultaneously. The destruction was total. Estimates vary, but even Polybius, a pro-Roman chronicler of these events, even he totals the Roman dead at 70,000. Others give smaller numbers of dead, but make up for them with larger numbers of men captured. Among the dead were some 80 men of senatorial rank and 2 former consuls, as well as one of the present consuls, Aemilius Paulus. The next morning, the Carthaginians were still busy, roaming the battlefield and slaying the moaning wounded. One large group of 3,000 or 4,000 Roman soldiers and allies managed a successful breakout. A number of smaller groups also escaped. Among the survivors was the consul, Gaius Terentius Varro. He rallied all the surviving troops at Canusium, a nearby town, and gathered other breakaway groups until he commanded a motley force of somewhere between 10 and 15,000 men from all backgrounds. Also surviving the battle was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young son of the consul who had been wounded in battle the year before. Fortunate was Rome that this young hero survived. Ever since he had invaded Italy, Hannibal had been hoping for the dissolution of Rome's alliances, for her subject and allied states to come over to him. As the first 2 years of the war passed, he had been frustrated by the solidity of Rome's political front, by her allies and her colonies' stubborn clinging to the Republic. Now that would finally begin to change. Roman colonies all over Italy would begin to break away. In Sicily, Hero would remain loyal, but he was quite old by now, and soon after he died, his successors to power in Syracuse would look to Hannibal as their liberator. Hannibal was also frustrated by the stubbornness of Carthage itself. Since arriving on the Adriatic coast, he had implored his rulers in Carthage to send him some aid, supplies, more soldiers, ships, anything. They sent nothing. Even his brother in Spain had failed him. Hannibal had planned for young Hasdrubal to bring a reinforcing army over to Italy the year after the invasion, but he had been kept busy by the Roman legions that had been sent to Spain for just that purpose. Rome, you see, still had the manpower for all this. We hear about these terrible losses at Trasimene, at Cannae, and elsewhere, and we think surely Rome must have been running out of men. But both modern and ancient estimates of Rome's population suggest that she probably had several 100,000 men of combat age available. The loss at Cannae was terrible, yes, but the cupboards were not bare in terms of manpower. And Hannibal would learn, as his father had, that there was nothing in the world like Roman tenacity. Rome had something else too, something which I have already pointed out in a previous episode. They had Gaius Terentius Varro. Yes, the failed commander at Cannae who thought it wise to attack Hannibal and had lost the flower of Rome's manhood on the battlefield. But I'm not speaking of Varro's military contribution here. I'm speaking rather of the fact that the Romans did not execute him. In fact, he was not even punished, though he probably felt and was moved by regret over the tragedy of the battlefield loss. Varro would go on to other commands in the war, and he would hold important political roles in the post-war period many years later. A Carthaginian commander who experienced the same failure could very well have expected to be crucified. Execution for failure is a powerful motivator, no doubt, in getting men to perform. We have Roman honor to thank that such a savage practice, though, has not been handed down to us, their posterity. And Rome was also acquiring something amid all this suffering and loss: experience. Hannibal's success on the battlefield is due to more than just one man's genius. Much like Alexander the Great from the previous century, Hannibal was surrounded by capable junior officers. Hannibal could detach a portion of his forces to circle around the enemy, to hide in ambush, to reconnoiter the enemy effectively, because he had such men with him. Rome did not have the same resources in men. This is not to disrespect Roman soldiers and officers. It's just that the Roman system relied heavily on the commands of the man at the top and the discipline of the men below him to carry out those orders, no matter how challenging their completion might be. Napoleon Bonaparte, the great conqueror of our own 19th century, he had a famous saying, which I will paraphrase here: "Do not engage the same enemy too often, or you will teach him all your tricks." The value, you see, of not executing officers and soldiers who fail at war is this: they can learn from their errors and become better soldiers and officers. Even as Rome was losing terribly, the survivors of those battles were learning. Men like the younger Publius Cornelius Scipio were coming away from these losses with valuable information in their heads, information about Carthaginian tactics, about their arms, about their habits. Hannibal failed where Alexander had been successful because Alexander rarely encountered the same force twice. He fought the Persian army only a handful of times, and usually each succeeding enemy force was made up of mostly new soldiers and officers. Therefore, no one had a chance to learn from him. But Hannibal had been fighting in Rome for 2 full years now, and they were learning about him. The wave of his power crested here at the Battle of Cannae. Never again would he be so successful against Rome. And Rome had something else going for it as well. Carthage relied on mercenaries to do the majority of their fighting. Some of their upper-class members, like Hannibal, did go to battle, but most of them stayed involved in commerce back home. They did not rotate into the war like Rome's senators did. But Rome had a brave upper class. One thing that distinguishes the Roman aristocrats of the past and the Western aristocrats of today is the amount of skin in the game. Take note that scores of high-ranking men died at Cannae. The upper classes of Rome had much more to win in this war. This is true. They were fighting for their dominion over the wealth of a mighty nation, but unlike the upper classes of our own age, they were not afraid to enter combat alongside their subjects. They did not send other men to do their fighting for them, but marched and died at their side. On the other hand, Roman reluctance to unify command limited their effectiveness against Hannibal. A modern listener might ask, why didn't they just elect a dictator for the duration of the war or keep successful men on longer in their posts? Why were they so eager to remove from the field men who had won victories? The history of later Rome will provide understanding. We should neither underestimate nor underappreciate Rome's fear of a monarchy. A successful, admired public leader is a threat to all other men in power. We have seen this in Greece already, how leadership was usually rotated, even when one man showed unusual ability or charisma. All men understood back then that even a slow, fumbling, collective decision-making body is better than a capable lone ruler because the collective body prevents tyranny. This is why the Romans were so cautious with their temporary dictatorships and rarely eager to repeat them. Those of us who have never experienced tyranny may have a difficult time understanding their reluctance. Finally, before I close out the episode, I want to make another point about the accuracy of this account. As you listen, you must keep in mind that all this is ultimately a story that I am telling you. I have consulted the sources, I have reviewed the maps and considered the geography and put together a narrative. But the sources that I consult do not even agree among themselves, and the rivers have changed course, and the languages of the combatants are dead and rarely studied. And the histories were all written after the war and by the victors. Did Minucius Rufus really screw up in battle versus Hannibal only to be saved by Fabius? Did he really humble himself before Fabius after the battle and declare his loyalty? Rufus died at Cannae, so he could not protest Fabius's depiction of the event, and Fabius would have powerful descendants decades later when the histories were being written. But Rufus did not have influential descendants. In fact, one of the primary sources for these events was written by a descendant of Fabius. If you are an American, you might consider how differently the Civil War was perceived and recorded by men from opposing sides. Do you think Confederate President Jefferson Davis's mammoth history of the war completely agreed with the official narratives of the victors? Who are we to believe? And there are myriad difficulties with timelines that I've either glossed over or simply not addressed. Did things really happen this way? Even the Battle of Cannae has doubts surrounding its narrative. Did Hannibal really intend this maneuver, or did it just happen naturally, that the retreating Carthaginian forces stiffened and that the Romans by chance found themselves surrounded? Many of the same doubts were expressed earlier about the battle at Marathon in Greece centuries before. Did Miltiades plan it that way, or did it just happen? In the end, the past is a story that we let others tell us, and each of us must make a decision about how much we believe and why. In the next episode, we will hear more about other theaters in which Rome was simultaneously fighting, such as in Greece and Spain, and about the meandering years of the war that followed the defeat at Cannae. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.